The snow had not yet fallen, but the wind promised it would. It pushed in from the north dry and bitter like a warning carried down from the mountains. Fence wire thrummed beneath its breath, and brittle cottonwoods cracked where they stood half dead along the ditch. The sky was a pale, hurting gray, the kind that swallowed sunlight without giving anything back. Beneath it, the girl moved alone across the pasture, her skirts stiff with dirt and frost, her shawl clutched close at her neck. Her boots were worn through at the toes' soles, soft with damp, and each step left a smudge in the dead grass. She carried the smallest child against her chest, bound tight with linen and wool, though the wrap sagged from long use and sleep-deep weight. The other two, no older than 5, followed behind like shadows, silent, cold eyes, too wide and knowing for children. They had walked nearly 7 miles since dawn. Her name had once been Rose, but even she had stopped saying it. The man who had promised her wheat fields and winter-fat pigs had disappeared the week before, taking the wagon and all the horses. No note. No goodbye. Just the last scrape of a wheel in dirt, and the emptiness that followed. She had waited 2 days, rationing the beans, boiling old bones for broth. By the 3rd morning, the milk goat was dead, and her own hunger had grown teeth. So she gathered what she could, wrap the baby, told the boys not to speak unless they had to, and started walking. No direction, just away. The frost in the grass bit at their legs. A hawk circled above once, then vanished. By mid-morning, her legs trembled. She kept moving only because stopping meant dying. The children were quiet out of instinct. There was nothing to say. Hunger had a way of stripping things down. The world grew simple when it hurt, walk or fall, breathe or break. When the boy stumbled and scraped his palm on a stone, she kissed it and tied a strip of cloth around his wrist without a word. They passed a split rail fence with no house behind it, just more emptiness. A broken yoke lay half buried in the grass, and the wind had gnawed the wood silver. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. She crested the ridge before the plains opened wide, and there, faint, crouched low in the land like it didn't want to be found, was a house. It looked near to death. The boards had grayed, and one side of the roof sagged like a man shot in the leg. No smoke came from the chimney. No dog barked. Just stillness. Still, it was something. Shelter. And maybe that was enough. She didn't remember crossing the last quarter mile. Her mind swam with white spots and the ache in her shoulders. By the time she reached the gate, her knees gave and she dropped to one side, the baby curling tighter in the fall. A voice said, "You ought not die on my land." Not cruel. Not kind. Just a voice. She looked up and saw a man standing in the doorway, rifle lowered but held. He wore a coat too large for his frame, the collar patched with fur, and his eyes were the color of wet earth. His face was weathered, unshaved, but young enough to still hold shape beneath the wear. "I didn't come to die," she rasped. He looked at her, at the children, at the way she pressed her hand to the baby's back even now. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he stepped down, opened the gate, and took the older boy's hand. "You'll come in then." He carried the baby, who didn't stir. She walked just barely, following the trail of his boots, through a yard gone foul with weeds and ice. Inside, the air was dry, warm, with a small fire, and smelled faintly of lye soap and tobacco. He set the child in a wooden crib beside the hearth. She collapsed on the floor, too tired to thank him, too full of grief to cry. He poured water into a dented cup and offered it to her. "What's your name?" he asked. She took the water, drank. Her hand trembled so badly she spilled some on her chin. After a while she said, "It doesn't matter." He nodded. "All right." He didn't press. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow began to fall in dry, slow flakes, clinging to the window panes like the hands of ghosts. Inside, the fire cracked and popped, and for the first time in many nights, she did not feel the dark pressing quite so close. The man did not ask more questions that night. He lit 2 lanterns and hung one by the rafters. The other he left on the table where its flicker stretched long shadows across the walls. The children curled beneath wool blankets on a cot in the corner. He gave them cornbread and a little jerky, but made no fuss when the older boy saved half for the morning. That kind of thinking, he knew, came from long hunger, the kind that reshaped a child's bones. She slept by the hearth, wrapped in an old coat he laid over her shoulders. Sleep took her like a tide, slow, steady, irreversible. Her boots were still on. Her hands curled into fists. Even in sleep, she held herself braced as if waiting for someone to strike. He watched her without meaning to. Not with lust. Not even with pity. Just a quiet, troubled interest. The sort a man might feel toward a wounded mare that made it home alone, bloodied but still breathing. The next morning, she woke before dawn. She moved stiffly, favoring her left side, and her eyes darted toward the children. All still there. All safe. Then she looked at the man. He was already up splitting wood out back. She stepped outside and stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around her middle. The snow had stopped. Frost coated the fence rails, and the creek nearby was sheathed in ice steam rising like a veil from its surface. He didn't look at her when he spoke. You can stay a few days. Woodpile's still got some meat under it. Barn needs fixing if you're looking for trade. She hesitated. I don't want charity. He set down the axe. I didn't offer charity. I offered work. She nodded just once. That day she cleaned the floors, chopped carrots that were soft at the ends, milked the one remaining cow with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. He watched her from the doorway as she brushed straw from the stalls. Her movements were slow but certain, like someone who had learned to survive by doing things right the first time. He brought her a pair of boots that had belonged to someone else, too big but warm. She didn't ask whose they were, and he didn't offer. Over the next days, a rhythm formed. She rose early, fed the children, cooked what little there was, mended tools. He worked the land in silence. They spoke little but enough, the kind of talk that mattered, storms coming or that roof nails loose. No wasted words. Once she asked about the photograph on the mantel, faded, the image nearly gone, but he only said that was before. He never said what before meant. Later, she found a child's boot tucked behind the stove. Just one. No dust on it. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, she asked, "Did you lose someone?" He didn't look up from the leather he was oiling. Yes. He didn't say more. And she didn't ask again. But something shifted between them. On the fourth morning, she followed him to the shed to help patch the broken wall. Her hands were raw from work fingers cracked at the knuckles, but she held the board steady as he hammered. When the nail bent and he cursed softly, she smiled for the first time. "You hit like my son," she said. He chuckled. "He must be a mighty man then. He's 4. That was the first real smile between them. It didn't last, but it lingered long enough to warm the cold space between their bodies. One afternoon, she found him carving wood on the porch. Not a fence post or a tool handle, but something small. Delicate. A bird in mid-flight, wings curved like a question. She didn't speak, just watched. He glanced up. "I carve when I can't sleep." She sat down beside him, careful not to touch. "I used to sew when I got scared," she said. "But the last time I tried, I couldn't thread the needle. My hands wouldn't stop shaking." He passed her the bird. "For you." She looked at it for a long moment, then placed it in her coat pocket. That night she cried, quietly into her hands, back turned from the fire. Not because of the bird, not even because of the past, but because the warmth felt like a betrayal. Because she'd nearly forgotten what safety tasted like, and that terrified her more than anything. If this land tested your heart, stay and see who else it tests. The thaw came slow. The ground remained hard but light, lingered longer each evening like it too was learning to stay. She began working the vegetable patch behind the shed. The earth there was dry packed tight, but she knew how to coax life from it. She dug with her bare hands when the hoe-cracked fingers blackened with soil nails broken. Her breath smoked in the morning air. The children played nearby, quiet and careful, as if afraid loud joy might drive everything away. The man, his name was Eli. She'd learned one dusk as he tied wire along the fence line, watched her from a distance. He didn't hover. He'd spent too long alone to be the hovering kind. But when the oldest boy cried after falling from the stump, Eli lifted him gently, pressed a cloth to the scrape, and handed him a whittled horse he'd made the day before. No words, just the gesture. She saw it, and something in her bent softened. One night while shelling the last of the dried beans, she asked, "Why are you alone?" He hesitated, ran a hand through his beard. "My wife died 5 winters ago. Fever took her fast. And the child." He didn't answer right away. Not the fever. The silence after. She understood what he meant. After that, something between them grew quieter but deeper. They began to share the smallest of things, slices of apple left on the sill to dry the good tin cup instead of the dented one, the last stitch in a mended glove. She fixed his coat, patching it with cloth from her own dress hem. He left half of his biscuit on her plate without comment. These were not grand things, but they were steady. One morning he found her sitting on the porch, elbows on knees, face drawn. "The girl is sick," she said. "Fever." She didn't look at him. He nodded. "There's a man in town, preacher's brother, knows his plants. Town's 2 days. Then I'll leave tonight." He took the mare, the only horse left, and what little coin he had buried beneath the hearth. She watched him ride off at dusk, silhouette, framed by rising dust. The sky behind him turned blood orange, then bruised to purple. She stood on the porch long after he'd gone. The fever climbed through the night. The child burned and moaned. She bathed her in creek water, sang songs with no melody, clutched the baby to her chest like she could drag her back from the edge with breath alone. By dawn, the child quieted. Still burned, but breathed easier. She didn't sleep. She just rocked, eyes dry from being too tired to cry. Eli returned by dusk the second day, face raw from wind hands blue at the knuckles. He handed her the crushed pouch of herbs without a word. She brewed the tea and fed it to the girl in small sips. 3 days later, the fever broke. She found Eli in the barn oiling tack, pretending not to wait for news. "She's better," she said. He exhaled. It sounded like the last breath after a long-held one. She stepped closer. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," he said. "You just don't see it yet." She didn't know what to say, but she stayed, didn't turn away. Later that night, after the children were asleep, she stood by the fire with her arms wrapped around herself. "I was 15 when I left home," she said. "Married a man I thought was better than my father. He wasn't. He drank and ran, and I followed. Every time. I thought this time would be different, but it's all been the same." Eli said nothing. She looked at him. "Do you think people like us can ever be new again?" He poked the fire. "I think we can be better than what broke us." She stared into the flames, thinking of all the things she'd left behind, and the small, strange hope blooming in her chest like spring beneath snow. Spring came late and slow, creeping in with uncertain steps, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The creek ran higher with meltwater. New grass pierced through the old frost-burnt patches in the yard. Birds returned, nesting in the rafters of the barn, calling to each other at dusk like gossiping neighbors. The world softened inch by inch. So did they. She took to sitting with Eli on the porch after supper. Not speaking much, just watching the sky lose its fire, the stars press through. One evening she brought him a jar of pickled beets she'd salvaged from a cellar pit behind the shed. He hated beets, but ate them anyway. Said nothing, just nodded once in thanks. When her youngest took her first step in the dusty yard, it was Eli who saw it. He looked up from his work, smiled quietly, and said, "She's fast for such short legs." That night, she cried again, but differently, softer. She began to braid her hair again in the mornings, even if it was just to tuck it under a rag. Eli trimmed a piece of old leather into a new belt for her boy. The world somehow had made room for both of them. But peace never lasts long on the frontier. One evening, just as the wind turned strange, hot, and sharp and wrong, they heard the horse before they saw it. A man rode up drunk in the saddle mouth full of curses. His eyes were wild, his coat missing buttons. He stank of sweat and whiskey. It was her husband. He didn't recognize the children at first, didn't speak their names. Just yelled at her to pack up, said she was his, said she'd always been his. Eli stood still on the porch, hammer in hand, not threatening, not afraid, just watching. The man sneered. "What's this, Rosie, you worrying for shelter now?" She didn't flinch. "Not this time. I'm not going with you." He laughed. "You think he's going to keep you? You think he'll raise bastards that ain't his?" The boy stepped behind Eli's leg, holding onto his boot. She stepped forward. "You left us to die." The man spat. "You were never meant to be found." Eli stepped down from the porch. "You've said your piece. Now ride on." The man reached for his pistol, but he was too slow, too drunk. Eli didn't shoot. He just knocked the gun from his hand with the hammer and drove him to the ground with one strike to the chest. The man didn't get up for a long time. He groaned, rolled over, and looked up at her. "You always were trouble." She stood above him, silent. Eli said, "You can go, but you come back, I bury you." The man limped to his horse, rode off into the dusk like a shadow swallowed by night. Later, when the children slept and the wind returned to its quiet self, she found Eli fixing the porch rail. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. "You don't owe me thanks." "I know," she said, "but I'm giving it anyway." He straightened. "You're not just safe here. You're wanted here." That undid her more than anything. Not the rescue, not the protection, but the plain truth of it. She stepped closer, rested her head against his chest. He hesitated, then wrapped his arms around her. Gently, like someone holding a bird that might still fly away. No more words were needed. That night she dreamed of wheat fields and warm hands. The kind of dream she used to think belonged to other women. The next morning she began planting rows in the garden with real seeds, not scraps. She taught the boy to carry water without spilling. She started sowing again, not to escape fear, but to build a life beyond it. By midsummer, the land had started to change for real. The garden bloomed with squash and string beans. Chickens, they thought long gone, returned from the hills and nested under the barn steps. Eli built a smokehouse from salvaged planks, and she learned to salt pork, the way her grandmother had shown her when she was no taller than the kitchen table. They worked without ceremony, without declarations, just side by side as if they'd always done it. She painted the doorframe blue one morning, her favorite shade from a dream she barely remembered. Eli didn't comment, but that evening he handed her a handkerchief dyed the same color. She tucked it into her apron, her fingers lingering on the edge. He began showing the boy how to ride, holding the reins together, steadying the saddle with one hand. On Sundays, they all walked to the ridge and watched the sky ripple gold over the valley. The little one toddled in the tall grass. The older girl braided dandelions into her mother's hair. Sometimes Ellie held her hand. Sometimes he just stood close. It was the kind of life that felt borrowed, fragile, like glass held in sunlight. But time, even when gentle, never forgets to test you. One day, a letter arrived. folded, stained, sealed in red wax. Brought by a trader who said nothing, just tipped his hat and left. Eli stared at it for a long time before placing it on the mantel. She noticed the way his jaw clenched. You going to open it? Not yet. That night, she waited until the house was still, then sat beside him near the fire. He finally opened a letter. It was from his brother. A land dispute inheritance of the old family homestead back east. Someone contesting Eli's ownership, someone willing to drag his name through court and worse. If he did not go back to settle it, he could lose everything he had ever owned, including this land. He handed her the letter. I never thought it would matter. I thought I left it all behind. What will you do? I don't know. She swallowed. If you leave, I might not come back, he said, his voice raw. The children were asleep upstairs. The fire hissed. Outside, an owl called. She stood slowly, walked to the door, opened it. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth. I won't stop you, she said. You owe them something, maybe, but I won't beg. He stood, walked to her, took her hand. I don't want to leave you. She looked up at him. Then stay. I don't know if I can. Her breath caught. Then go. He held her hand longer than he should, then let go and stepped into the dark. She didn't sleep. She packed his bag before sunrise, leaving space for the carving knife and a spool of twine he always carried. She placed the wooden bird inside. When he came down the stairs, she handed him the bag. He took it, held her gaze. If I stay gone too long, I'll wait, she said, but not forever. He nodded. That's fair. He left before the sun cleared the ridge. The children watched from the window. The days after were quiet. Not heavy, just empty. She worked the garden, fed the chickens, kept the fire. She waited. 1 week. 2. On the 13th day, she stopped checking the ridge at dusk. On the 19th, the mare returned, riderless reins trailing foam on her flanks. Her heart seized. Then restarted. He was not dead, but something had happened. She saddled the old mule and packed what little food they had. The children she left with the widow Harlow 2 valleys over. She said nothing more than I'll come back with him or not at all. The road to the next town took her 3 days. She found him in the county jail, beaten, bruised, but alive. He looked up from the cot, managed half a smile. They said I trespassed. Said I forged land papers. I told them I didn't care about that place anymore, but they wouldn't listen. She stood there, jaw set. I came to bring you home, she said. He lowered his head. I'm tired, he whispered. She stepped forward, knelt, took his face in her hands. Then let me carry you now. They let him go on the 4th day. The charges dropped quiet, like same as they'd come. Someone had lied, papers had been switched, and it wasn't Eli's name on the land anymore anyway. A cousin's scheme, bitter and cruel. But the law moved slow, and in the meantime he'd taken fists meant to shame and silence him. He limped when he walked, couldn't lift his right arm without pain. But he smiled when he saw the mule, still waiting at the edge of town, her hands steady on the reins. They rode double the trail, long and broken in places, but familiar. He dozed against her back, the 2nd day breath warm through her coat, his weight a comfort she hadn't known she missed until now. She reached behind, gripped his knee to make sure he didn't fall. When the house came into view, weathered and stoic under the late summer sun, he exhaled like it was the first breath he'd taken in weeks. The children ran to meet them. The youngest tripped and fell, then crawled the rest of the way, laughing. Eli swung off, the mule slow, careful of the bruises, and knelt in the dirt to gather them in. No one spoke, but their bodies said enough. That night, after supper, after the children slept, and the fire had died to embers, She took his hand. You came back. He looked at her. I told you I didn't want to leave. But you did. I had to. I wanted to prove I wasn't running from anything. And now I want to prove I can stay. She held his gaze. Then ask. He drew in a long breath, held it. Will you stay with me, build something that doesn't have to be borrowed? Her answer came without pause. Yes. But only if it's built honest. It will be, he said. Every bit. They married on a Tuesday with only the children and the wind in attendance. She wore a clean dress. He carved rings from walnut wood, dark and plain. She cried when he slid hers on. He held her hands afterward like they were sacred, kissed the scars on her knuckles without shame. They buried the past, not in forgetfulness, but in forgiveness. A marker was placed at the edge of the field for the child he'd lost, a second beside it for the girl she had been before the wilderness had stripped her down. Each morning she passed them with a nod, a prayer, a promise. The house was never perfect. The roof leaked sometimes. The stove needed fixing. But it was theirs. She planted sunflowers by the porch. He built a crib from pine for the baby that would come by spring. Because there would be another. A sign that life, however battered, still reached forward. The boys grew tall. The little girl sang. And Eli, no longer a ghost of a man, laughed with his whole chest when he watched them run through the fields. One evening, as golden light spilled across the floorboards and the scent of fresh bread filled the kitchen, she leaned against the doorframe and watched him lift the baby round and new and strong into his arms. He turned to her. She looks like you. She stepped forward, pressed a kiss to the baby's head. No, she whispered. She looks like all of us. Like what we became. Outside, the last of the summer wind stirred the chimes. The earth was quiet, full, and still. They had survived. And not just survived, but chosen each other. That she knew was everything. The trail bends ahead. Stay with us.